The sun had barely risen when the widow heard tires crunching over gravel. She pulled aside her floral kitchen curtain and froze. 6 black SUVs were lined across the front of her ranch. Each one had the HOA logo slapped across the door like some sort of war flag. Men in cheap sunglasses and vests marked Enforcement Unit jumped out like they were storming a battlefield. "This property is in violation of Code 108B, one of them barked, slamming a metal notice onto her gate. They didn't ring the doorbell. They didn't knock. They climbed the fence. At first, they were cocky, laughing, joking, pulling out tape measures and cameras like they were shooting an episode of Extreme Yard Makeover, HOA edition. But then they heard it. A low, guttural growl. One of the trespassers turned. Guys?" From the back of the barn, 3 massive German shepherds emerged slowly. Ears up, eyes locked, bodies tensed like trained soldiers. The leader took a step back. "Whose dogs are those?" Too late. The dogs sprinted. Men screamed, stumbling over each other, trying to escape. One guy dove into a bush. Another leaped onto the hood of the SUV. And the widow? She stood at the porch in her bathrobe, arms crossed, sipping coffee. "I told you," she muttered to herself. "I don't need no man to protect this land." Cut to black. But how did it get to this point? Who was this widow? Why did the HOA think they had the right to invade her property? And what exactly made those dogs so deadly trained? Her name was Helen McKinley, and she had lived on her 6-acre ranch in northern Idaho for nearly 40 years. She was 72, silver-haired, and walked with a cane. But don't let that fool you. Helen had fire in her bones. She was the widow of Sergeant Major Jack McKinley, a decorated Marine who passed 2 years ago from cancer linked to service exposure. After he died, Helen didn't sell the ranch. She didn't downsize. She stayed. Why? Because it was theirs. And because of the dogs. Jack had spent decades training K9s for military deployment. After retirement, he kept raising them, only now for security and protection work. He taught Helen everything. 3 of those dogs still lived with her. Blitz, Ranger, and the Duchess. They were more than pets. They were family. And they were lethal. After Jack's funeral, neighbors from the nearby HOA community started snooping. Helen's ranch bordered a fancy development called Pinewood Hills Estates. All the homes had white fences, community rules, and monthly dues. Helen's place didn't. No HOA. No rules. Just her, the dogs, and wide land. But the HOA president, a snippy woman named Marlene Doyle, had other plans. "She's an eyesore," Marlene hissed during a board meeting. "That rusty mailbox, the horses, the barking dogs. It lowers property value." One of the board members, a spineless guy named Ken, whined, "But she's not part of our community." "Not yet," Marlene smirked. "But we'll make her." So it began. First, fake notices were mailed claiming her barn violated regional fence ordinances. Then, drone cameras started flying over her land. Then came the threats. "If you don't join the HOA, we'll take legal action." Helen ignored them all. But the pressure built. Until one day, Helen's water line was accidentally cut during a neighborhood utility upgrade. 2 weeks later, her mail stopped showing up. Helen wasn't stupid. She knew exactly what they were doing. So she trained harder with the dogs. She reinforced her barn. She installed cameras of her own. One peaceful morning, Helen sat on the back porch with a photo of Jack in her hand. "I miss you, Jack," she whispered. "They think I'm weak without you. But they don't know what you taught me, do they?" Blitz came over and rested his head on her lap. "I know, boy," she said with a soft smile. "They're coming soon." Days later, a stranger in a blazer knocked on the front gate. "Mrs. McKinley?" he asked. She peered through the fence. "Yes. I'm Richard Sawyer from the HOA Legal Compliance Team. We've reviewed your land boundaries and—" "No, you haven't," she interrupted, "because you have no right to review them. I'm not part of Pinewood Hills. Never have been. Never will be. Ma'am, there's a new development. I know my land. You step 1 foot on it, and you're trespassing. Tell that to your president." He left, but she could see it in his eyes. They weren't going to stop. 3 nights later, the ranch lights flickered. Helen grabbed her flashlight and cane. The air was too quiet. Even the dogs were alert, but still. She stepped outside and scanned the tree line. Then movement. 6 figures in tactical vests, scaling the fence under the cover of night. No knocking. No warning. Just like a raid. Helen clicked a remote in her pocket. The barn lights turned on. And the dogs? Already unleashed. Growls thundered like a war drum. One of the men screamed. "They're coming." Helen stood on the porch. No fear in her eyes. "You trespassed," she said loud and clear. "And now they're going to teach you a lesson." The next morning, Helen barely slept. The men had run screaming. One had wet himself and was dragged out by his own teammates. Another twisted his ankle trying to leap the fence. None dared press charges. They couldn't. Because, technically, they were trespassers. And Helen? She'd called the sheriff before the dogs were even released. Not to report a crime, but to warn them. So when Sheriff Douglas Rourke pulled up the next morning, his first words were, "Mrs. McKinley, you're really going to make me file a report over grown men trespassing and getting spooked by house pets?" Helen didn't laugh. She pointed to her gate. The HOA trespass warning sign she had posted months ago was now bent in half, clearly ripped. "Is that not vandalism, Sheriff?" He rubbed the back of his neck. "Well, yes, ma'am, technically it is. But Marlene Doyle came into my office screaming bloody murder at 6 a.m., saying you unleashed killer animals on her people." Helen narrowed her eyes. She said what? He rubbed the back of his neck. "Well, yes, ma'am, technically it is. But Marlene Doyle came into my office screaming bloody murder at 6 a.m., saying you unleashed killer animals on her people." Helen narrowed her eyes. She said what? Let's rewind. Marlene Doyle, president of the Pinewood Hills HOA, was a kind of woman who wore matching sweater sets even in July. She believed in order, elegance, and resale value. To Marlene, Helen's ranch was a stain on her neighborhood's image. No matter that Helen's land was private. No matter that it had been there before Pinewood Hills was ever built. Marlene wanted control, and she didn't take embarrassment lightly, especially after her so-called enforcement team came back covered in mud and dog scratches. Now she wanted blood. Sheriff Rourke took off his hat. "Helen, I like you. Jack was a good man. But I have to be honest, Marlene's gunning for you now. She's hired a private lawyer. And if she files suit, she can try," Helen cut in. "But she'll lose." "Are you sure about that?" Helen walked over to her porch bench, lifted the cushion, and pulled out a folder. Inside were deeds, surveys, and an affidavit from Jack, signed and sealed. "This land," she said, tapping a weathered map, "was grandfathered out of HOA jurisdiction when Pinewood Hills was approved 22 years ago. Jack made sure of it." The sheriff let out a long whistle. "Then you're airtight." Helen nodded. "But she doesn't care about the law, Doug. She cares about power." Later that day, Helen tried to return to her routine, feeding Duchess her boiled chicken, brushing Ranger's coat, training drills with Blitz command, "Stop the intruder." She tried to pretend things were normal, but they weren't. The ranch felt watched, and she was right. Up in the hills near the tree line, someone was using a long-range camera. That evening, a black SUV pulled up again. This time, it wasn't enforcers. It was Helen's son, David McKinley, a former Navy SEAL. David had stayed away from the ranch after Jack's death. Too many memories. Too much pain. He stepped out tall, square-jawed, wearing his faded service boots and aviator shades. "Mom," he said, "I saw the footage on your home camera. What the hell is going on?" Helen swallowed a lump in her throat. She hadn't seen him in nearly a year. "They came for the land, David, just like Jack said they would." He scanned the property, the dogs, the new fence posts. Then back at her. "Do you want me to stay?" Helen hesitated, then nodded. "For a little while, just until this settles." David walked over to the barn and smiled at Duchess. "I taught her that takedown trick," he muttered. Helen smiled faintly. She remembered. That night, Helen dozed off in the living room recliner, clutching her cup of chamomile tea. David stood watch on the porch with Blitz sitting alert beside him. Then headlights. Again. Only this time. A sheriff's cruiser. Sheriff Rourke stepped out, holding a legal document. He didn't meet David's eyes. "Mrs. McKinley," he began. She stepped out. He continued, voice tight. "Marlene filed an emergency injunction. She claims the dogs are a community threat, and the court approved temporary removal of them by morning." Helen's hand shook. "They want to take my dogs?" Sheriff nodded grimly. "Yes, ma'am. Animal control will be here at 7 a.m. David clenched his jaw. "She's trying to disarm you," he growled. Helen's eyes narrowed. "No," she whispered. "She's trying to break me." 6:30 a.m. The countdown begins. Helen barely slept. She sat on her front porch in silence, her eyes red from holding back tears. Her fingers trembled around her coffee cup. Duchess laid her head in Helen's lap, as if sensing something was wrong. Blitz paced near the barn, his body on high alert. Ranger was stationed by the gate. And David? He was dressed in full tactical gear, boots laced, black tee tucked in, military pants, and a steel stare that could shatter glass. "Mom," he said quietly, "they'll be here in less than 30 minutes. Do you want to fight this, or let them take the dogs?" Helen didn't speak. She just reached for a rusted ammo box under the porch steps, opened it, and handed David a folder. Inside, her husband's final will, K-9 service certifications, federal protection letters for retired military dogs. David's eyes widened. "These dogs are registered veterans," he muttered. Helen nodded slowly. Jack filed everything, just in case. 7 a.m. They arrive. 2 white animal control trucks pulled into the gravel lot, followed by a shiny black car with a Pinewood Hills logo painted across the side. Out stepped Marlene Doyle, perfectly pressed pantsuit, oversized sunglasses, and a smug little purse dog in her arms. "This is going to be delightful," she chirped. Behind her, 2 animal control officers approached the gate, holding tranquilizer guns. Marlene called out, loud enough for the neighbors nearby to hear. "We're here for the aggressive beasts this woman has been hoarding. This neighborhood will finally be safe." Helen stood up, back straight despite the pain in her knees. David stepped forward, one hand casually resting on his belt. "You're not taking those dogs," he said. Marlene laughed. "Oh, really? And who exactly are you supposed to be?" David removed his sunglasses. "Lieutenant Commander David McKinley, U.S. Navy SEAL, retired. These dogs served 2 tours in Afghanistan. You're not taking them anywhere." The animal control officers hesitated. Marlene scoffed. "I have a court order. Move." David pulled out the folder and handed it over. "Read this first." One of the officers opened it and began flipping through the pages. Ma'am," he turned to Marlene, "these dogs are federally protected under the War Dog Retirement Act. Removing them without Pentagon clearance would be, well, a felony." Marlene's smug smile twitched. "I don't care what paperwork he has. You have a judge's order. But the federal law supersedes state orders," the second officer said quietly. We can't touch them." Marlene's mouth twisted into a sneer. She turned to Helen. "You think this is over?" she hissed. "You live in a ratty shack surrounded by flea-bitten animals and a landmine of code violations. I will bury you in fines, citations, and lawsuits. Enjoy your victory while it lasts." David stepped between her and his mother. "You just threatened a senior citizen and a veteran," he said calmly. "She threatened me," Marlene screeched, turning to her tiny dog. "This is elder abuse in reverse." Helen, quiet all this time, stepped forward. "No, Marlene. This is your mistake. You thought I was alone. You thought I was weak. But I'm still standing. And you just tried to steal federal service dogs from a war widow." Her voice turned sharp. "You better pray no one reports you to the authorities." Marlene's jaw dropped. David looked at the officers. "Are we done here?" They nodded. "Yes, sir." The trucks drove away. Marlene stormed off to her car, slamming the door so hard her purse dog yelped. That night, after dinner, Helen sat alone in the barn office, flipping through old photo albums of Jack. Pictures of him in uniform, of the dogs he trained, of the barn when it was new. Her hand paused on one photo. Jack standing beside Duchess as a pup, holding a sign that read, "She's got more fight than any soldier I ever trained." Tears filled her eyes. David entered quietly. "You okay?" She wiped her cheek, just wishing he could see all this. David pulled up a chair beside her. "He sees it, Mom. And I think he'd be proud. You didn't just survive. You won." She smiled faintly. "I'm not done yet." The next morning, 2 large trucks arrived. Government marked. Agent Collins stepped out with 3 uniformed officers and an entire mobile K-9 simulation unit. Helen's ranch had officially become a military K-9 training partner site. She watched as Blitz, Ranger, and Duchess were gently introduced to new drills, controlled environments, simulated rescues, threat response trials. One officer turned to her in awe. "These dogs aren't just trained," he said. "They're elite." Helen nodded proudly. "My husband made sure of it." David helped install new fencing, camera towers, and a dedicated training field. For the first time, Helen's ranch wasn't just protected. It was empowering. 4 days later, a convoy of black vehicles pulled into Pinewood Hills. This time, it wasn't Helen. It wasn't David. It was Homeland Security. Marlene answered her door, still in a silk robe, assuming it was delivery. But when she opened it, Agent Collins stood at her doorstep. "Mrs. Doyle," she said flatly, "you are hereby under investigation for obstruction of federal programs, tampering with a protected military asset, and conspiracy against a war widow." Marlene's face turned white. I didn't know. I just wanted to enforce community standards." "You crossed a federal line," Agent Collins replied. "Multiple, actually." Marlene's voice shook. "I have rights." Agent Collins held up a warrant. "You'll have your day in court." Marlene was escorted to the SUV as stunned neighbors watched from behind blinds and flower pots. Back at the ranch, Helen received a bouquet of sunflowers and a handwritten note at the gate. It read, "Thank you, Mrs. McKinley. We were too scared to speak up, but you stood your ground. You reminded us what real strength looks like." A grateful neighbor. Helen smiled. David walked up beside her with a toolbox. "What's next?" he asked. Helen looked around the ranch, then at the training officers, at the dogs, at the barn her husband built. "We build," she said. That night, as the stars lit up the Idaho sky, Helen sat on the porch sipping tea. Suddenly, a soft knock came from the gate. She stood curious. There, on the other side of the fence, stood a young woman in army fatigues, holding the leash of a nervous German shepherd pup. "I heard this place trains real working dogs," the woman said. "I lost mine in deployment last year. I'm trying to start over. I was wondering if you train people too." Helen's eyes welled up. She stepped forward, opened the gate, and smiled. "Welcome home, soldier." Helen stepped forward, opened the gate, and smiled. "Welcome home, soldier." The ranch no longer looked like a quiet retirement property. Flag poles waved in the wind, the dirt road had been graded and graveled, and a new training pavilion with the words, "McKinley Tactical K-9 Academy," was being painted on a large wooden sign near the front gate. David stood with his arm around Helen, watching 2 military handlers run obstacle drills with Duchess and Ranger. Blitz rested in the shade nearby, panting but proud. "I never thought this place would come alive like this again," Helen said softly. David looked at her. "You gave it life. You just needed the world to catch up." Back in Pinewood Hills, Marlene Doyle's mansion was in chaos. Her phone buzzed nonstop. HOA board members were resigning left and right. Some were being questioned by local police. Others were receiving subpoenas. Her husband, a real estate developer, stared at the kitchen counter. "You told me this was just about property values," he said, voice tight. "Now I've got FBI agents asking about drone footage and bribery." Marlene slammed her coffee cup down. "This is all her fault. That widow. If she hadn't fought back." "She's not the problem, Marlene. You are." He walked out. And for the first time, Marlene felt it. Not anger, not power, but fear. Within 3 days, Ken, the board member caught cutting power, officially turned whistleblower. 2 other HOA members confessed to falsifying documents. Pinewood Hills, HOA faced a federal audit for misuse of dues, unauthorized surveillance, and voter suppression on community decisions. Sheriff Rourke visited Helen again. He tipped his hat. "Looks like the HOA's finished." Helen smiled. "About time." Later that evening, Helen visited her husband's grave on the east side of the ranch, near the old elm tree. She knelt down slowly and brushed dust off the plaque. Sergeant Major Jack McKinley, beloved husband, devoted trainer, quiet warrior. She placed a new photo at the headstone, one of her standing between Ranger and Duchess in front of the new training center. "I hope you're watching, Jack," she whispered. "They tried to take everything, but they forgot one thing." She looked toward the ranch house where David stood on the porch, speaking with a military recruiter. "You taught me how to fight." A week later, Helen was tending to her garden when she heard tires on gravel again. Another black SUV. But this time, it wasn't Homeland Security. It was the governor of Idaho. He stepped out, a short, balding man in a suit too formal for a ranch. 2 news reporters followed behind. "Mrs. McKinley," he greeted. She wiped her hands on her apron. "That's me." He shook her hand warmly. "On behalf of the state of Idaho, I'm here to award you with the State Medal of Civil Valor for bravery, integrity, and service to veterans." Reporters snapped photos as Helen stood frozen. "For what?" she asked. The governor smiled. "For reminding the nation what real American strength looks like." The next day, under the big elm tree, dozens of people gathered. Veterans, military families, local ranchers, former HOA residents, even Sheriff Rourke in uniform. Helen wore a simple navy blue dress and held a small bouquet of daisies. David stood behind her, hands on her shoulders. Agent Collins from Homeland Security handed her a framed certificate. Then the governor stepped forward with the medal. She didn't cry. Not yet. But when a small line of active service dogs marched forward, saluting with their handlers, and Ranger, Blitz, and Duchess barked softly in unison, she choked up. And the crowd rose in applause. Helen stood in front of a group of young handlers in uniform. The ranch was now fully developed. Obstacle fields, kennels, a command center, and classrooms. She held up a clicker and spoke with command. "Rule number 1 of training, AK-9. You earn their respect with consistency, not cruelty." One woman raised her hand. "Is it true you once sicked your dogs on a rogue HOA unit?" Helen smiled. "I didn't sick them. I unleashed them." The class burst into laughter. David walked over holding 2 folders. "Applications from out of state," he said. "Veterans looking to volunteer here permanently." Helen raised an eyebrow. "Looks like we're not just a ranch anymore." That evening, Helen checked the mail and found a crisp envelope with a White House seal. She opened it carefully. "Mrs. McKinley, your courage, resilience, and continued service to this nation have not gone unnoticed. We would be honored if you would accept an invitation to the Presidential Veterans Gala this fall. You are to be seated at the front table, and we ask you bring your 3 K9 heroes as honorary guests. Office of the President of the United States." Helen folded the letter slowly, a soft smile breaking through. She called out the window, "David, get your tux ready, and tell the dogs they're going to Washington." Blitz barked from the porch. David chuckled. "Mom, we need to get them bow ties." Helen laughed, louder than she had in years. And just like that, the widow they tried to break became the legend everyone would remember.